The slap cracked across the marble hall like a gunshot in the night, and Augustin Vale, standing at the edge of a glass balcony overlooking the bay, wishing himself anywhere else on earth, turned toward the sound and saw a woman he had never met struck across the face before 150 people, and found that his feet were already moving before he had decided to. He had not wanted to come to this charity gala. Augustin Vale, head of the family that ruled half of Baltimore, a man of 34, whom the underworld called the ISIS Men, a name he had cultivated on purpose, disliked high society parties, the way other men dislike an old scar that aches before a storm, and so he had chosen his position at the far edge of the balcony, half hidden in shadow, from which he could observe the whole bright, cruel machinery of the wealthy without being drawn into it, which was how he came to see the whole of it. The young woman stood pressed against the service tables, in a maid's uniform painfully plain amid a forest of silk and diamonds, holding a tray she gripped as though it were the only thing anchoring her to the ground. She watched the party the way one watches a fire from the cold side of a window, and then an older woman, proud and cold and heavy with jewels, bore down upon her with the particular predatory energy of a person who has found in a crowd a safe target for her cruelty. There were words Augustin could not hear from the balcony, only the older woman's face twisting with a venom she made no effort to hide, the younger one going pale and very still, and then that hand rose and swung and struck her full across the cheek, hard enough that her head snapped to the side, hard enough that the crack of it carried the length of the hall and stilled every conversation in the room. For a single heartbeat, the whole party froze, and in that frozen heartbeat, Augustin saw two things that decided him. He saw the young woman not cry out, not clutch her face, not flee, but slowly, deliberately straighten her spine and lift her struck cheek, and turn back to face the one who had hit her in a silence more dignified than any protest. And he saw the crowd, the glittering, watching crowd of the elite do the thing such crowds always do. They did not move to help. Not one of them said a word. They drew back half a step, the way water draws back from a stone, their faces arranging themselves into expressions of delicious, scandalized interest, content to watch, content to enjoy it. And Augustin Vale, who had spent his life perfecting the art of caring for no one, because he had once paid too dear a price for caring, long ago, and had sworn never to pay it again, found that his feet had already carried him off the balcony, and across the bright room, the crowd parting before him as it always parted before his name, just as the older woman's hand was rising a second time, and Augustin caught that wrist, held it and suspended an inch from the young woman's face, before the whole silent room, and said very quietly, "I think not." But what Augustin Vale did not yet know, in the moment he crossed that room, was that the girl in the maid's uniform held a secret bound to the very past he had buried for all these years, and before that winter closed, they would both pay a price that neither of them had seen coming. If you enjoy stories like this, please hit the like button to support us. Don't forget to share this video with others who also love dramatic romance stories. And subscribe to the channel today so you won't miss any upcoming episodes. The woman jerked her wrist violently, but she couldn't pull free from Augustin's unyielding grip. And in that instant, all the arrogance on her face shattered into something caught between fury and panic, because she realized that the man who had stopped her hand wasn't some unfamiliar guest she could bully into silence, but a man who carried the terrifying stillness of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed. She opened her mouth, preparing to say something about propriety, about private family matters, about a mother's right to discipline those who belonged to her household. But Augustin gave her no such opportunity. He merely looked at her with green eyes as cold as the bay in winter and released her wrist, slowly and with unmistakable contempt, the way a person might drop something filthy they had no desire to hold for even a second longer than necessary. Then he did the cruelest thing a man of his position could do to someone so desperate for attention. He turned his back on her completely and faced away as though she had never existed, as though she were nothing more than an empty space in the room, and gave his full attention to the girl in the maid's uniform standing silently before him. The entire room understood the meaning of that gesture at once, because in this world of wealth and privilege, there was no humiliation deeper than being treated by a powerful man, as though one weren't even worthy of his gaze. Della stood there with the deepening red mark still spreading across her cheek, her ash-gray eyes lifted toward him, with the wariness of an animal so accustomed to being struck that it no longer knew how to trust an offered hand. In her life, whenever someone showed her kindness, it was usually only the prelude to some new humiliation, whose shape she hadn't yet recognized, and she watched Augustine as though waiting for the trap to close, her body leaning slightly backward in instinctive defense, her calloused hands still gripping the edge of the tray as though she would fall if she let it go. Augustine saw all of it. He saw the distrust that had rooted itself so deeply it had become instinct, and the weariness in those young eyes that seemed far older than her years. He didn't move any closer. He didn't reach for her or do anything that might make her feel cornered once again. He only lowered his voice until it was barely loud enough for her alone to hear through the heavy silence of the room, and asked her a question so simple that even he hadn't expected it to carry such weight. He asked her name. For a moment, she only stared at him without understanding, as though the question belonged to a language she had forgotten long ago. Because how many years had passed since anyone in the house where she lived, or any guest who crossed its threshold, had cared enough to ask her name? To them, she was merely the girl, that one, the servant, a silent shadow who carried trays, cleared away the remnants of parties, and then withdrew into a dark corner. She was never a person with a name and a life worth remembering. Yet now, before 150 people holding their breath and watching, the most powerful man in the room had bent slightly toward her and asked the ordinary question the entire world had forgotten to offer her for so many years. Her lips moved, and it took a moment before her voice finally emerged, soft and faintly trembling, but not broken. She told him her name was Delphine Marsh, though everyone called her Della. Augustine repeated the name once very softly, as though placing it somewhere inside himself where it could never be lost. Della, he said, and there was such strange reverence in the way those two syllables that even she fell still. Because the name that had become something cheap and contemptible in the mouths of her stepmother and stepsister, the name that was now spoken only alongside shouted commands and cruel instructions, sounded from this man's lips like something precious, as though she herself were precious. Behind him, the older woman remained where she stood. The marks of his fingers were still visible around her wrist. Her face pale with rage she had nowhere to unleash, and fear that grew stronger with every passing second. The wealthy crowd remained frozen as well, glasses suspended in their hands, unfinished conversations hanging in the air, all of them witnessing something none had ever imagined they would see. The Iceman of Baltimore, the man rumored never to have cared for another human life, was standing in the center of a glittering gala hall and gently asking the name of a poor maid, and no one in that room, not even Augustine himself, understood that such an ordinary moment had just opened a door, leading directly into tragedy and into the past he had buried for so long. It was the reverence in the way Augustine spoke her name that jolted the older woman out of her shock, because Coralie Marsh couldn't bear to watch the stepdaughter she had spent 5 long years reducing to a shadow suddenly come in the center of the entire room. So she stepped forward, reclaiming the sharp, imperious voice she always used to crush those beneath her, and declared for everyone listening that this was a private family matter, that the girl belonged to her household and was her responsibility, and that no matter how powerful or influential Mr. Vale might be, he had no right to interfere in the discipline of a family that wasn't his own. Her voice struggled to sound firm, but anyone paying close attention could hear the trembling hidden beneath it, the sound of someone clinging desperately to the last scrap of authority she still imagined she possessed. Augustine didn't turn around at once. He allowed her words to fall into the silence of the room and dissolve like foam upon water, and only then did he slowly turn halfway toward her, only halfway, as though she weren't worth the effort of facing completely. When he spoke, his voice remained as quiet as before, still low and even. The kind of voice everyone who had ever opposed him knew was far more dangerous than an eye out. He told her she was mistaken. This had ceased to be her private affair the moment she chose to strike someone in front of 150 people. When a person assaulted another in a crowded room, that person made it the concern of everyone who witnessed it, and he happened to be one of them. He went on to say that he had seen her raise her hand a second time, not in some uncontrolled burst of anger, but slowly and deliberately, because she had been certain that no one in that room would dare stop her. Then he paused for a moment and told her she had been wrong about that, and the way he said those words sent a chill across the backs of many people in the crowd. Coralie opened her mouth to argue, but Augustin lifted one hand, no more than a small gesture, yet it was enough to silence her completely. In a voice so calm it was almost terrifying, he added that she should be grateful they were at a party, and that he was a man who knew how to preserve appearances, because in another place and under different circumstances, she would learn far more clearly what happened to those who raised their hands against someone unable to defend themselves. He didn't explain who he was. He didn't need to. Something in his eyes and in the absolute stillness of his body sent a vague fear crawling down Coralie's spine, the instinctive terror of a small animal that had just realized it had clawed at the foot of a creature far larger and more dangerous than it had ever imagined. Augustin didn't waste another word on her. He turned back to Della and gently asked whether she wanted to leave. He truly asked. It was a question, not an order. He gave her the right to choose, something no one had offered her in a very long time, and Della looked up at him, then across at the woman who had ruled her life through fear for so many years. Perhaps it was simply being asked, being allowed to choose, that gave her the final measure of courage she needed, because she gave a small nod. Augustin didn't touch her. He merely inclined his body slightly and extended one hand ahead of her to indicate the way, allowing her to walk on her own feet. She placed the tray upon the serving table with a slow gesture that seemed almost ceremonial, removed the white apron that marked her as a servant, folded it carefully, and laid it on top of the tray. Then she lifted her head and walked beside the stranger who had crossed an entire room for her, passing through the wealthy crowd as they moved aside in stunned silence to let them through. No one dared stop them. No one dared utter so much as half a word. They only stood there and watched, the faces that had been bright with anticipation moments earlier, eager to witness another humiliation, now pale as they realized they had done nothing but stand by, while one of the most powerful men in the city did what every one of them should have done. Coralie Marsh remained alone in the middle of the hall, the marks still visible around her wrist and her fury left with nowhere to go. Tasting for the first time in her life what it felt like to have her entire world turn its back on her. She watched the stepdaughter she had believed completely under her control disappear beyond the great door aside a man whose name she didn't yet know, but whom she had already begun to suspect would mark the beginning of her own destruction. The car glided smoothly along the road beside the bay, leaving behind the brilliant lights of the mansion and the entire world that had turned its back while she was being struck, and inside the dimly lit cabin, where only the passing streetlight lights shimmered across the windows, Della sat pressed into the corner of the seat, her calloused hands resting on her knees as she struggled to keep her back straight and her shoulders from trembling. Because over the past 5 she had learned that revealing weakness before anyone was the same as opening a path for them to trample over her. Yet now, with no one left to guard herself against, with the tension that had held her captive throughout the entire evening finally releasing her, her body began to betray her will, and the tears came silently, not because she feared the unfamiliar man sitting beside her, but because of an exhaustion that had been building for far too long, the exhaustion of someone who had forced herself to remain strong for so many years that she had forgotten what it felt like to rest. She wept without sobbing, without making a sound, only tears slipping down the cheek that still bore the imprint of her stepmother's hand. Augustin said nothing for a long while. He didn't move closer, didn't reach for her, and didn't offer any hollow words of comfort, because a deep instinct told him that this young woman had been touched too many times that day, and not once with gentleness, that what she needed now wasn't an embrace, but a quiet place where she was allowed to fall apart without being judged. So he simply reached into the breast pocket of his coat, took out a neatly folded white linen handkerchief, and instead of handing it directly to her, placed it on the empty space between them, a small but thoughtful gesture that left the choice entirely in her hands, so she wouldn't feel imposed upon one more time. Della stared at the handkerchief for a moment, as though she weren't certain it was real, then slowly picked it up, and when her fingers touched the soft, smooth fabric scented faintly with sandalwood, a sentence now carried the kindness she hadn't known in far too long. Her tears began to fall more heavily. She pressed the handkerchief to her mouth to smother a sob. I'm ashamed of showing such weakness before a stranger. Augustin turned his face toward the window, not out of coldness but out of courtesy, giving her the privacy she needed. And only when her breathing had grown calmer did he speak, still in that low, quiet voice, asking who the woman from the party was to her. Della remained silent for a long time, so long that he thought she might not answer, but at last she said, her voice hoarse from crying yet strangely composed, that the woman was her stepmother, her father's second wife, the woman he had married when Della had just turned 20, in the hope of bringing warmth back into their home. She continued in the even voice of someone who had repeated her pain so many times inside her own mind that all its sharp edges had been worn away, explaining that her father had died suddenly, 5 years earlier, and from the moment he closed his eyes, everything in the house that had once belonged to her changed hands. Her stepmother and the woman's daughter gradually claimed every room, every possession, and every privilege, while Della was pushed lower and lower, from the daughter of the master of the house to a guest, from a guest to an unwanted dependent, and finally to an unpaid servant in the very home her father had left to her. She slept in a small room beside the kitchen, rose before dawn, and went to bed only after the rest of the household had fallen asleep, performing every difficult task without receiving a single word of thanks, only scolding and slaps whenever her stepmother was displeased. Augustin listened to everything in silence, his face revealing nothing. But the Nettenbazing rending on his knee had tightened into a fist without him realizing it, because every word she spoke touched something buried deep within him, something he had believed sealed away long ago. He asked why she hadn't left, why she had remained and endured it for 5 long years, and Della turned to look at him, her ash-gray eyes still wet but lit by a stubborn spark that made him pause. She answered that the house was all she had left of her father, the only places in the world that still held the warmth of his presence, and she had believed, naively, that if she endured long enough, justice would one day find its way to her. What she didn't know was that justice had just entered her life in the form of the man sitting quietly beside her in the darkness of the car. The car finally turned onto a long private road lined on both sides with rows of dark trees, then came to a stop before a gray stone mansion rising solemnly into the night, not gaudy or ostentatious like the place where the party had been held, but carrying a quiet majesty that made it clear at a glance that its owner was a man who didn't need to flaunt his power in order to prove it. When the car door opened, an older woman was already waiting on the front steps, her silver-streaked hair gathered neatly into a bun, her posture straight in a simple dark dress, her kindly face marked by the wrinkles of someone who smiled often, and she came down to welcome Della with such natural warmth that it left her confused. Augustin briefly introduced her as Ruth Ann, the woman who had cared for the house since before he had reached adulthood, then told her in his familiar low, quiet voice that Miss Marsh would be staying there for a while, and that Ruth Ann should prepare a warm room for her and provide anything she might need. Ruth Ann simply nodded as though her cold and distant master, bringing a strange young woman home, in the middle of the night were the most ordinary thing in the world, then turned to Della and extended one hand, not to take hold of her but merely to show her the way, saying warmly that she must be exhausted and should come inside, because there was a fire burning and hot tea waiting. Della followed her into the vast marble-floored entrance hall, and the moment the warmth from the fireplace touched her face, the instant the scent of tea and burning pine reached her, she suddenly stopped at the threshold, her entire body tightening like a wild animal that had been lured into a place far too comfortable, while every instinct warned her that such comfort must come at a price. Over the past 5 years, she had learned that kindness was never given freely, that whenever someone treated her gently, there was always a demand, a condition, or a trap waiting afterward, and she stood there with both hands clenched together, her wary eyes moving around the room, as though searching for the danger still hidden from view. Ruth Ann noticed her tension at once, and instead of urging her forward or showing impatience, she slowly stepped back to give her more space, then gently told her that no one there would make her do anything, that she could sit if she wished, remain standing if she preferred, or go straight upstairs to rest, and that everything was entirely up to her. Those simple words, "up to you," spoken so calmly as though the right to choose had always belonged to her, bewildered Della more deeply than any shouted command could have, because it had been far too long since anyone had allowed her to make a choice about anything. Augustin stood behind her, silently observing it all, and he didn't come closer or interfere. He only said something to Ruth Ann that he deliberately meant for Della to hear, that no one in that house would be permitted to force her to do anything against her will, that there would be no orders and no harsh words, and that if any servant dared say anything that made her feel inferior, that person would answer directly to him. He spoke with the same calm, even voice that everyone in the mansion understood couldn't be challenged. Della lifted her eyes to him, and for a moment something flickered in their ash-gray depths, something caught between suspicion and a fragile thread of hope she didn't dare allow to grow, because she was still waiting for the moment when all this kindness would reveal its true face, waiting for the instant when this man would turn to her and demand something in exchange for shelter and warmth. But that moment never came. He merely inclined his head to her in the slightest of farewells, wished her a good night, then turned and disappeared down the dark corridor, leaving her with the kindly housekeeper and the warm fire burning in the hearth. And that night, when she was shown to a spacious room, with a bed softer than any place she had slept during the past 5 years, Della sat for a very long time on it without daring to lie down, her eyes still fixed warily on the unlocked door, unable to believe that somewhere in this world there could truly be a place willing to offer her shelter without demanding that she pay for it with pain. It wasn't until nearly dawn, when physical exhaustion finally overcame even her distrust, that she drifted to sleep with all her clothes still on, ready to wake and run at any moment. The first days at the Vale estate passed beneath the wariness of someone still waiting for disaster to strike, and Della kept herself quiet as a shadow, trying not to trouble anyone. Out of old habit, she continued waking before dawn and attempting to go downstairs to help in the kitchen, but each time Ruth Ann gently stopped her and guided her back to the dining table, where a hot breakfast had already been prepared for her, as though she were an honored guest rather than a servant. It was during those quiet days of observation that she began to realize the man who had brought her there was nothing like the cold and powerful figure she had first imagined him to be. She watched him treat the servants with a rare sense of fairness. He never raised his voice, never humiliated anyone, yet he was never indulgent either. Every word he spoke was measured, and every order was so clear that no one could misunderstand it. She noticed that when a young vimpan broke a valuable antique vase and dropped trembling to his knees in expectation of punishment, Augustin merely looked at him for a moment, then told him to stand. He said that no matter how precious a vase might be, it was still only an object, and that whether the boy had cut his hand on the broken porcelain mattered more to him than the vase itself. The young man looked up at him with stunned gratitude, while Della, standing half-concealed behind the doorway, fell silent as well, because in her former home even a single chipped plate had been enough for her stepmother to unleash a storm of fury upon her. She saw that he was cold, undeniably so, but it was the coldness of a man who had built a thick wall around himself so no one could ever reach him. Slowly, she came to understand that coldness didn't mean cruelty, that beneath that frozen exterior lay a kindness hidden so carefully that even its owner seemed reluctant to admit it existed. And each small discovery caused the wall of caution inside her to weaken a little more. Then, late one night, when the entire estate had fallen asleep, but she couldn't rest because the old dreams continued to haunt her, Della quietly left her room in search of a book that might soothe her into sleep. She followed the dark corridor to the vast library, where firelight still spilled through the narrow opening of a door left slightly ajar, and when she pushed it open and stepped inside, she stopped upon seeing Augustin sitting there alone in an armchair beside the hearth, an open book resting on his lap and an untouched glass of liquor beside him. The fire cast over his face an expression of weariness and loneliness that he never allowed anyone to see during the day. She started to withdraw, but he looked up and quietly told her to come in, saying the library didn't belong to him alone. Perhaps darkness made honesty easier. Or perhaps the stillness of the room and the soft crackling of the fire had eased the vigilance that never fully left her. But for the first time, Della sat in the chair across from him and began to open her heart. She told him about her late father, about the evenings when they had read together beside the fireplace, while her mother was still alive, about her father's deep, warm voice reciting poetry, and about the way he had always called her the little light of his life. She also spoke of the years after his death, not to complain, but simply to set down a little of the burden she had carried for too long. Augustin listened in silence, never interrupting and never looking at her with pity, only asking an occasional brief question that showed he was truly listening, and that sincere attention led her to say far more than she had intended. In turn, he revealed a few things about himself as well. Not much, only enough for her to sense that this man also carried an old wound within him that had never healed, a loss that had taught him to close his heart. As the final logs in the fireplace slowly faded into glowing embers, the two strangers sat together in a warm and peaceful silence, each following their own thoughts, and for the first time since entering that house, Della realized that her heart had stopped beating with constant caution, that she had spent an entire hour beside this man, without once waiting for disaster to fall upon her. Yet, as she stood up to leave, her eyes briefly fell upon an old, faded photograph tucked inside the book. Augustin had been reading a photograph showing her late father, Edmund Marsh, standing beside a younger Augustin at the harbor years ago. The discovery sent a quiet shiver through her, a sudden whisper of doubt that lingered in her mind long after she returned to her room. More than anything else, that realization left her both relieved and frightened, because she understood that the moment one began to obsess was also the moment the heart became most vulnerable to being hurt, while Della quietly carried her newly awakened suspicions within her, not daring to confide in anyone. Elsewhere in the city, Augustin had already set an investigation of his own in motion, because from the very night he took her away from the party and listened to her speak of the 5 years she had spent in torment, something in her story had refused to leave him in peace, an irregularity that the instincts of a man accustomed to using through conspiracies warned him concealed far more than the simple cruelty of one woman. And so he summoned Wendell Boone, his trusted lieutenant, a quiet man with a face as sharp as a blade and a calculating mind that never strayed from the truth, and charged him with digging through the entire history of the Marsh family, especially everything connected to Della's late father. Wendell was a man who worked without noise. He knew how to slip into places ordinary people could never reach, how to make locked doors open and tightly sealed lips begin to speak, and within only a few days he uncovered things that made even him, a man who had witnessed every form of ugliness the world could offer, draw his brows together in unease. He discovered that Della's father, Edmund Marsh, hadn't merely been the insignificant accountant everyone believed him to be, but had once managed the records of a substantial trust fund, an inheritance left by Della's mother before her death for the sole purpose of securing her daughter's future when she came of age, a sum large enough for a young woman like Della to live comfortably for the rest of her life without ever bowing her head to serve anyone. But what made Wendell sit for a long time over the yellowed pages was the evidence that the trust had been drained under deeply suspicious circumstances, not all at once, but through a series of smaller withdrawals stretched across the final months of Mr. Marsh's life, and continuing even after his death. The withdrawals had been carefully disguised beneath all manner of false legal purposes. The signatures had been forged with remarkable skill. Powers of attorney had appeared at precisely the moments when no one could verify them, and every stream of money had ultimately flowed into accounts hidden behind so many layers that only a man with Wendell's experience and patience could have followed them to the end. The deeper he dug, the clearer and more chilling the picture became, because he realized this wasn't a case of a greedy woman simply seizing her stepdaughter's property when the opportunity arose. It was a scheme planned in advance, a machine operated by several hands working in careful coordination, and Edmund Marsh's death, occurring at the exact time the largest withdrawals were being made, no longer appeared to be the meaningless coincidence recorded on a lifeless death certificate. Wendell gathered everything he found into a thick file, arranging the documents chronologically so the course of the conspiracy could be seen as clearly as possible, then brought it to Augustine in the privacy of his study late one evening. As Augustine turned each page beneath the lamplight, his expression grew steadily darker, and his green eyes, already cold, hardened into something glacial, because what lay before him didn't merely confirm his suspicions, but went far beyond the worst he had imagined. He understood that the young woman sleeping beneath his roof, the woman he had believed to be only the victim of a bitter stepmother, was in truth the victim of a far greater crime, one that had stolen not only her youth and dignity, but perhaps the father she had loved as well. Yet there was one thing even Augustin didn't fully understand at that moment, that when the thread of the conspiracy was pulled all the way to its end, it would lead far closer to his own past than he could have imagined, and that the name concealed behind layer upon layer of hidden accounts would soon force him to confront a truth he had spent years trying to forget. Meanwhile, at the old Marsh family home, Coralie spent the first days after the party seething with a simmering fury mingled with bewilderment, because the sudden disappearance of the stepdaughter she had believed completely under her control had overturned the entire order she had spent 5 years building. And what enraged her most wasn't the loss of an unpaid servant, but the way the girl had lifted her head and walked away beside that unfamiliar man before the eyes of high society. The way Coralie, for the first time in her life, had felt her own world turn its back on her and look upon her with judgment. She wasn't the sort of woman who easily surrendered anything she considered hers, and so she began making inquiries everywhere in an effort to discover Della's whereabouts, sending servants throughout the city, drawing information from the most talkative members of society. And before long she learned that the girl was staying in an imposing gray stone mansion in one of the most prestigious districts along the bay, owned by a man named Augustin Vale. At first, that name inspired no fear in Coralie, because she had spent her life circling within the shallow world of afternoon teas and drawing-room gossip, a world where a person's worth was measured by ancestry and advantageous marriages, and she had never crossed into the underworld where the name Vale was spoken with caution and fear. In her mind, Augustin was simply some mysterious, newly wealthy man, an arrogant rich fool who had impulsively taken in a poor girl for his own amusement, and she assured herself that the interest of men like him never lasted, that before long, once he grew bored, he would cast the girl into the street as casually as he might discard an old toy. It was from that arrogant and short-sighted belief that Coralie began devising a plan to reclaim Della, not because she needed the girl, but because she couldn't bear the thought that the stepdaughter she despised might escape her grasp and find a better life. More importantly, deep within herself, she knew that as long as the girl remained under her control, the secret of the fortune she had quietly stolen over the years would remain buried, because Della was the only person still alive who would accidentally uncover the truth if she were allowed her freedom, and had someone powerful standing behind her. Coralie discussed the matter with her daughter Priscilla, the spoiled child who had inherited every measure of her cruelty and envy, and together the two women wove their scheme, deciding that they would find a way to approach Della and use every weapon available to them, from false affection and appeals to family loyalty to veiled threats, in order to weaken her resolve. They would convince her that the man was only using her, that family blood was still more trustworthy than any stranger, and if sweet words failed, they would turn to harsher methods and force her to return, dragging her back into the old position, where Coralie could continue draining every ounce of strength from her and, more importantly, silence her forever. Coralie smiled at her own reflection in the large drawing-room mirror, adjusting her hair and the expensive jewels purchased with the very money she had stolen, confident that with her cleverness and social connection, reclaiming a weak and penniless girl was only a matter of time. What she didn't know was that the name Augustin Vale, which she had spoken with such contempt, was the very name that made the most powerful men in the city lower their heads, and that by reaching into that hornet's nest, she was taking the first steps down the road that would lead directly to her own destruction. The first step in the scheme, devised by the mother and daughter, was entrusted to Priscilla, and she chose a move far more vicious than ordinary sweet talk or threats, because she understood that the quickest way to draw Della out from beneath the roof protecting her was to make the man himself doubt and reject her, and nothing destroyed trust faster than an accusation of theft. Priscilla cleverly found a way to approach one of the servants at the Vale estate, a young maid who was both foolish and greedy, and bribed her to secretly hide a valuable piece of jewelry belonging to the Vale family inside Della's room. Then, Priscilla herself appeared openly at the estate under the pretense of being a concerned sister coming to visit, and while the household staff were gathered together, she pretended to suddenly recognize the necklace Ruth Ann had just discovered was missing, then loudly insinuated that Della had always been light-fingered, that she had stolen things many times back at home, and that it was truly unfortunate for Mr. Vale's kindness to be exploited by someone like her. The accusation was delivered at precisely the right moment and in precisely the right place, and within seconds suspicious eyes turned toward Della, while whispers spread among the servants. The atmosphere was painfully familiar, because it was the same atmosphere in which she had lived for the past 5 years, the feeling of being surrounded by judgments against which she had no means of defending herself. For one brief moment, her old instincts returned, and Della nearly lowered her head out of habit, nearly folded herself back into silent endurance like an animal accustomed to receiving blows without resistance. But then something else awakened inside her, something the days of kindness beneath that roof had quietly nurtured, a spark of self-respect she had believed dead long ago. She suddenly understood that if she lowered her head this time, she would remain forever the broken person Coralie had created, and that the time had come for her to stand upright, not for anyone else, but for herself. And so, for the first time in her life, instead of retreating, Della lifted her head and stepped directly in front of Priscilla. In a voice that was quiet yet so steady that it made Priscilla herself falter, she demanded that her room be searched immediately in front of everyone. She said she feared no search because she knew she was innocent, then looked directly into Priscilla's eyes, and asked how she could possibly know which missing piece of jewelry was the necklace when Ruth Ann hadn't yet said what had disappeared, a question as sharp as a blade that caused the color to shift across Priscilla's face. Della's composure and clear reasoning brought the entire room to a halt, because no one had expected the quiet and submissive young woman to defend herself with such dignity. At that moment, Ruth Ann, who had already grown fond of Della and possessed a keen eye for deceit, stepped forward to support her and suggested that the suspicious young maid be brought in for questioning. Under the pressure of so many watching eyes and relentless keen questions, the bribed servant finally began to tremble and expose the cracks in her story, stumbling through contradictions until the truth slowly emerged, revealing that someone had paid her to stage the entire deception. Priscilla saw the situation turning against her and realized the scheme had failed, so she hurriedly claimed there must have been some misunderstanding and left in humiliation. But the venomous look she cast back at Della before walking through the door made clear her that this wasn't over, that the mother and daughter wouldn't stop until they obtained what they wanted. As for Della, when everything had finally settled, she stood silently in the center of the room with her heart pounding, not from fear, but from a strange feeling rising inside her chest, the feeling of someone who, for the first time in many long years, had dared to stand up and defend her own dignity and had won. In that moment, she understood that the weak and submissive person she had once been was slowly dying within her, making way for a stronger young woman, someone even she had never known she was capable of becoming. Auguste returned to the estate just as the commotion had begun to settle, and, from a single glance at the lingering shock on the servants' faces and the unfamiliar straightness in Della's posture as she stood in the middle of the room, he understood that something serious had happened beneath his roof. When Ruth Ann recounted the entire story, explaining the false accusation Priscilla had arranged and the way Della had confronted it herself and turned the situation around, his expression didn't change, but his green eyes darkened into a glacial shade that every man under his command recognized as the sign of fury held tightly in check. He ordered the bribed young maid brought before him, and without raising his voice even once, using only that low, quiet, measured tone and his penetrating gaze, he made her confess the whole truth, that Priscilla had approached her, pressed money into her hand, instructed her to hide the jewelry in Della's room, and told her how to construct the accusation. When the truth had been fully exposed before every servant in the household, Augustin did something he rarely ever did. He publicly cleared Della's name in front of them all, declaring plainly that Miss Marsh was an honored guest in his home, that no one would be permitted to stain her reputation, and that anyone who still chose to believe those fabricated accusations wasn't worthy of remaining in his service beneath that roof. Declaration, spoken with the full authority of a man feared and respected throughout the city, swept away every lingering trace of suspicion, and restored to Della not only her innocence, but something she had lost far too long ago, the dignity of having her worth acknowledged before others. She stood there in stunned silence, feeling something warm rise behind her eyes, because throughout all 5 years of being crushed beneath cruelty, no one had ever defended her that way, and no one had ever used all their power to protect her honor without demanding anything in return. That night, after the estate had fallen quiet again, Augustin found Della in the corridor leading to the rear garden, and this time he no longer maintained the distant formality of a master speaking to a guest. He came to stand beside her and quietly asked whether she was all right, whether the cruel words spoken during the day had wounded her, and there was such genuine concern in his voice that her suspicious heart wavered, because she hadn't forgotten the photograph in the library or the chilling situation surrounding her father's death. Yet, in the face of such gentleness, she found it difficult to believe that the man worrying about her now could once have harmed her family. Della told him she was all right, then after a moment of hesitation, softly thanked him for defending her. Augustin looked at her for a long time beneath the pale moonlight spilling through the window, then said in his deep, warm voice that he hadn't done it out of pity, but because he believed her, because he had seen in her a kind of integrity and courage that few people possessed, and because someone like her deserved far more kindness than life had ever given her. Those simple, sincere words melted another piece of ice from the wall she had built around herself, and in that moment they stood closer than they ever had before. The invisible boundary between the powerful masteress of the facade and the young woman who had once been treated as a servant seemed to fade away, leaving only two wounded souls quietly recognizing something familiar in each other. When their eyes met in the stillness of the night, they both felt something growing between them that neither dared to name. Yet, even in the midst of that fragile warmth, somewhere else in the city, Coralie had just received a warning from an acquaintance in high society that drained the color from her face. The name Augustin Vale, which she had treated with such contempt, belonged to the ruthless king of Baltimore's underworld, and in that instant, her arrogance shattered for the first time into genuine terror. A few days later, Wendell returned with the final part of the investigation, and what he brought back fitted the last missing pieces into a complete picture so devastating that even Augustin, who had prepared himself for the worst, sat in silence beneath the lamplight for a long time. The truth emerged naked and far more brutal than anything anyone could have imagined. Della's father, Edmund Marsh, hadn't died because his heart had failed from exhaustion, as the lifeless death certificate claimed, nor had he ever been burdened by debts, as Coralie had so carefully spread throughout the city after his death in order to conceal her crime. The entire story had begun with the trust fund Della's mother had left for her, a fortune Coralie had coveted from the moment she entered that household beneath the disguise of a devoted wife. She hadn't acted alone, because draining a trust protected by strict legal safeguards required the hand of someone deeply familiar with law and finance, and that person was an associate with whom Coralie had secretly conspired, a corrupt attorney who specialized in performing questionable services for the wealthy, a man who helped her fabricate documents, forge signatures, and gradually make the theft appear legitimate. Mr. Marsh, with the trained eye of a man who had spent years managing financial records, eventually discovered the suspicious withdrawals being made from his daughter's trust, and when he followed the trail and realized in horror that the wife he trusted was conspiring with another man to steal the future of the daughter he loved more than anything in the world, he threatened to expose everything, to bring the truth into the light no matter what price he had to pay. That threat became his death sentence. Wendell had uncovered evidence that on that fateful night, Coralie's associate had gone to see Mr. Marsh, and that the death so skillfully disguised as a natural stroke had in fact been the result of a carefully calculated act, a murder arranged to silence forever the only person capable of exposing them. The innocent 21-year-old woman Della had mourned and buried her father without ever knowing that she was laying a victim of murder to rest, not a man taken by illness. But the discovery that stunned Augustin most deeply, the one that forced him to set the file down and close his eyes for a long time, was the final piece connected to himself. Because Wendell had found proof that during the last days of his life, Mr. Marsh had gone to Augustin Vale himself and begged for help. The memory Augustin had tried to bury returned with terrible clarity, That stormy night 5 years earlier, when a thin, middle-aged man with terror in his eyes came to find him at his private office by the harbor. A stranger Augustin only vaguely recognized from a few shipping transactions. The man had pleaded for his help, saying he possessed evidence of a crime and that his life was in danger. But at the time, Augustin, still drowning in grief and shutting himself away after the death of his younger brother, had coldly refused to become involved. He had told the man it wasn't his concern, shutting his office door and leaving him to walk back into the pouring rain. And only a few days later, he heard that the man had died. For 5 years, Augustin had forgotten that brief encounter, placing it among the countless moments when he had chosen to turn away in order to protect his own cold and empty peace. But now, knowing that the desperate man who had knocked on his door that night was Della's father, and that perhaps Edmund Marsh might still be alive if Augustin had agreed to help him, a crushing guilt unlike anything he had ever known closed around his hardened heart. He understood that fate had bound him to the young woman sleeping beneath his roof in a way far crueler than he had ever imagined, that he wasn't merely the man who had given her shelter, but also the man whose indifference had once unknowingly contributed to the tragedy of her life. And in that moment, Augustin knew that he had delivered the truth and a chance to make amends, even though he also knew that once the truth was spoken, it might take from him forever the woman he had begun to love more than his own life. Fate seemed to have arranged matters so that the truth could remain hidden in darkness no longer, because that very night, while Della was still unable to free herself from the haunting image of the photograph in the library, she quietly went to Augustin's study intending to demand an explanation from him. And when she entered, she found him sitting motionless before the open file beneath the lamplight, his face burdened by a heaviness she had never seen before, and one brief glance at the papers spread across the desk, with her father's name clearly visible at the top of the page, was enough to turn her entire body cold. She asked him what it was, her voice trembling but resolute, and Augustin looked up at her, and in that moment he understood that the hour he had feared yet always known was unavoidable had arrived, that he couldn't and mustn't conceal the truth from her for even 1 second longer. So he rose, slowly invited her to sit, and in a low, quiet voice that made no effort to hide his pain, he told her everything Wendell had uncovered, about the trust fund her mother had left behind, about the conspiracy between Coralie and her corrupt attorney associate, about the way her father had discovered their scheme, and had been silenced through a death carefully disguised as natural. Della listened in a terrifying stillness, her face growing paler with every word he spoke, her hands clasped so tightly together that her knuckles turned white, because each truth brought into the light tore open another wound she had believed had already healed. And when she understood that the father she had loved hadn't passed peacefully from illness, but had been brutally murdered simply because he had tried to protect her future, an unbearable grief mingled with fury rose inside her until it lodged painfully in her chest, and the tears began to fall beyond her control. Not the silent tears of resignation she had shed that night in the car, but the burning tears of someone who had just discovered that their entire life had been built upon a vicious lie. Then, in the midst of her shock, Augustin did the hardest thing of all. He continued with the part of the truth that concerned him. He confessed that on that fateful night years ago, her father had come to him seeking help, had begged him to intervene while his life was under threat, and that Augustin, drowning at the time in his own grief and in the cold isolation he had built around himself, had refused. He had turned his back on Edmund and sent him away into the rain, only to hear a few days later that the man was dead. When those words were spoken, Della sprang to her feet as though she had been struck, retreating from him with her eyes wide in horror and pain, while a violent conflict erupted within her. Because the man standing before her, the man who had rescued her from the party, defended her honor, and awakened feelings in her heart she had begun to fear, was also the man who had been given a chance to save her father and had chosen to look away. Through her tears, she demanded to know how he could have been so heartless as to turn away from a man begging for his life, whether he understood that her father might still be alive if he had chosen to act that night, and whether all the kindness he had shown her had only been an attempt to atone for the guilt of what he had done years ago. Every question she asked drove like a knife into the very wound through which Augustin had already been punishing himself. He didn't defend himself. He didn't deny anything. He simply stood there and silently endured the full force of her anger because he knew he deserved it. And that quiet acceptance of his guilt only deepened the turmoil inside her, because she realized she couldn't simply hate this man as she believed she should. Caught in the storm between resentment for the past and the growing affection she couldn't extinguish, Della turned and fled from the room, leaving Augustin standing alone in his loneliness and remorse, knowing that the wall which had only just begun to open between them now stood in danger of collapsing forever. Della couldn't sleep that entire night. She sat beside the window, looking out over the dark garden, and allowed the conflict inside her to rise and fall in relentless waves. And it wasn't until dawn began to first pale rays, when her anger had quieted enough for reason to speak, that she realized there had been something in Augustin's remorseful eyes the night before that made it impossible for her simply to turn away. And so she went to him again, this time not to accuse him, but to listen, because she understood that if she truly wanted to face the truth, she needed to understand why this man had become the cold person who had turned his back on her father. Augustin was still sitting in his study as though he hadn't moved all night, and when he saw her enter, he lifted eyes hollowed by sleeplessness and torment. After a moment of silence, perhaps because he understood that she deserved to know every part of the man he was, he began to tell her about the past he had never revealed to anyone. He told her about his younger brother, a young man he had loved more than himself, the brother he had raised and protected with his own hands after their parents died too soon. He told her that many years earlier, when he had still been a man capable of trust and willing to open his heart, there had been someone he considered his closest friend, someone in whom he had placed complete faith and treated as family. Yet that man had betrayed him with unspeakable cruelty, using Augustin's trust to set a trap. And in that trap, his innocent younger brother had become the sacrifice, losing his life simply because he had stood beside Augustin, simply because the same blood ran through his veins. Augustin's voice grew hoarse when he reached that part of the story, and for the first time, Della saw his wall of ice break apart completely, revealing beneath it an immeasurable grief he had carried for years. He said his brother's death had taught him the brutal lesson that care and trust were deadly luxuries, that whenever he allowed himself to care for someone, that person became a weakness his enemies could use against him. And so he had built a wall of ice around himself with his own hands, trained himself to turn away from every plea for help, and transformed himself into the Iceman feared throughout the city, not because he was cruel, but because he was terrified of losing anyone else. He said that on the night her father came to him, he had still been deeply trapped inside that fear, and when a stranger knocked on his door and begged him to step into danger to save him, Augustin's instinct for self-preservation had coldly shut the door. It wasn't because he had no heart, but because he had trained himself never to care again. He confessed that it was a decision he would regret for the rest of his life, and that he didn't dare ask for her forgiveness because he some mistakes could never be forgiven. Della listened, and when his story came to an end, she realized that tears had been running down her cheeks without her noticing, no longer tears of resentment, but tears born from a painful understanding, because in his story she saw herself, a soul wounded so deeply that it had built walls in order to survive, just as she had once withdrawn into herself and learned to distrust every act of kindness after 5 years of being crushed. These two people, one a tormented former servant and the other a powerful, guarded crime lord, had seemed separated by an immeasurable chasm, yet now they understood that they carried the same wound within them, the same loneliness of those who had learned to live without daring to love because they feared loss. And that recognition began to mend what had seemed shattered beyond repair the night before. Della softly told him that she couldn't say her bad pain was gone, that the wound left by her father's death would continue bleeding for a long time, but she understood that he too was only a human being carrying scars of his own, not the man who had committed the crime, and that she couldn't hate someone who had dared to be completely honest with her. When she reached out and placed her hand over his tightly clenched one, they both understood that a new bond had formed between them, woven not from rescue, but from the understanding shared by two wounded souls, while beneath the roof of the Vale estate, two wounded souls were quietly finding their way toward one another. At the old Marsh family home, Coralie was living through the most terrifying days she had known since the warning about Augustin's true identity reached her ears. Because, as she made more careful inquiries and gradually came to understand that the mysterious wealthy man she had dismissed and intended to manipulate was in fact the Iceman of Baltimore, a man whose name alone was enough to drain the color from the faces of even the most hardened merchants, a man who controlled an entire network of hidden power stretching across the city. All her arrogance and confidence vanished in an instant, replaced by a freezing terror that crept down her spine. She suddenly recognized the true gravity of everything she had done, that she hadn't merely mistreated an insignificant stepdaughter, but had raised her hand against a young woman now protected by one of the most powerful men in the city, that the slap she had delivered to Della in the middle of the party before so many witnesses, and the scheme of false SLCC Priscilla Hassada had recently arranged and failed to carry out were no longer private matters confined within the walls of her home, but had become an offense in the eyes of a man fully capable of crushing her without the slightest effort, and that horror left her unable to eat or sleep, waking night after night with the feeling that disaster was hanging directly over her head. Yet what frightened Coralie even more than the prospect of immediate punishment was the possibility she scarcely dared to imagine, that if Della had the support of this man and enough time and resources to examine the past, then Coralie's darkest secret, the monstrous crime involving the stolen trust fund and the arranged death of Mr. Marsh, would sooner or later be dragged into the light, and when that happened she would lose everything, not only her reputation and position, but her freedom as well. It was that fear of exposure that transformed Coralie from an arrogant attacker into an animal cornered with nowhere left to run. And like every creature driven to the end of its path, she became more reckless and dangerous than ever, because she now believed she had nothing left to lose, and because only her saves by striking first. She conferred with the corrupt attorney, who had been her accomplice years ago, a man no less terrified now that their entire conspiracy threatened to collapse. And in their shared desperation, the two began constructing one final reckless move, a plan Coralie would never have dared consider when she had still felt secure in her own power. The attorney, who had extensive connections in the darkest corners of the city, proposed a sinister scheme. He said that a man as powerful as Augustin Vale must certainly have that many enemies in the underworld, men constantly waiting for an opportunity to bring him down, and that if they approached the right enemy and offered him the valuable information, that the cold and untouchable Iceman had finally revealed a weakness, a young woman he appeared determined to protect. Then they could use Augustin's enemy to eliminate the threat, named Della, draw the girl outside his protection, and at the same time keep Augustin occupied fighting his own rivals, so he would have neither the time nor the attention to investigate the past. Coralie listened with equal parts fear and temptation, because she understood that this was an extraordinarily dangerous gamble, that reaching into the underworld was no different from playing with fire, but the fear of being exposed and her final instinct for survival overwhelmed whatever reason remained within her, and she agreed to the attorney's plan, never imagining that this desperate move would ignite a chain of terrifying events, place the girl she hated in mortal danger, and force Coralie herself to face consequences more dreadful than anything she had ever inflicted upon another human being. The information the attorney delivered to Augustin's enemy fell into the most dangerous hands possible, because the man who received it was Silvano Ferro, a rival crime lord who had carried a bitter grudge against the Vale family for years, a ruthless, calculating man who had always waited for the just opening through which he might bring down the Iceman. When he learned that the cold and seemingly untouchable man had finally revealed a weakness of flesh and blood, a young woman he was determined to protect, Silvano immediately understood that the golden opportunity he had long awaited had finally arrived. When Coralie made that reckless move, she had naively believed she was merely using someone else's hands to push Della beyond Augustin's protection. I had never imagined that she was delivering a young woman into the hands of a notorious criminal who would stop at nothing, nor had she understood that once she entered the underworld, events would rush beyond her control with terrifying speed. Late one afternoon, while Della accompanied Ruth Ann to the market beside the bay to choose flowers, and while she was absorbed in admiring the roses, Silvano's men suddenly descended upon them. In the confusion of the crowded market, they quickly overpowered her, covered her mouth, and dragged her into a waiting car before Ruthann could cry out for help. It all happened so quickly that by the time the people around them understood what was happening, the vehicle had already sped away and vanished into the flow of traffic. Della was taken to an abandoned warehouse at the harbor and locked inside a cold, dark room, and although terror filled her heart, she refused to collapse. She kept her head raised and faced her captors with the same resilience that had carried her through 5 years of torment. And when Silvano came in person to examine his hostage, even he was briefly surprised by the unbroken look in the small young woman's eyes, the gaze of someone so familiar with suffering that fear could no longer defeat her easily. Ruthann returned with the terrible news of Della's abduction, and when Augustine heard it, something happened that no one had witnessed in all the years they had known him. The icy mask he had guarded so carefully shattered completely, and everyone present fell silent as the cold and untouchable Iceman revealed himself as nothing more than a man overwhelmed by terror. Not fear for his own life, but fear of losing the woman he loved. The very fear he had avoided for years by refusing to care for anyone now struck him with twice its former force, because he understood that the thing he had always dreaded most had become reality, that allowing himself to open his heart and love someone had turned that person into a weakness his enemies could target, exactly as they had once targeted his unfortunate younger brother. For one moment, the terrible memory of his brother's death nearly drowned him, and the old voice inside his mind whispered again that this was the price of caring, that he should never have allowed his heart to soften. But this time Augustine didn't allow fear to defeat him, because he understood that if he retreated now, if he let the cowardice of the past make him hesitate once again, he would lose Della forever and repeat the very mistake that had haunted him throughout his life. And so, within that darkest moment, a transformation took place inside him. His fear was forged into an iron determination, and the Iceman of old returned, but this time not to turn his back and protect his own cold peace, but to charge into the flames and save the woman he loved. He immediately summoned Wendell and every trusted man under his command, mobilizing every connection and resource at his disposal to find Della. When Silvano sent his first message demanding that Augustin come to meet him alone if he wanted the young woman kept safe, a threat that clearly revealed his intention to use her as bait and lure him into a trap, Augustin didn't hesitate, because this time he was prepared to sacrifice everything, even his own life, so he would never again endure the agony of a man who stood by and watched someone he loved die because of his own cowardice. While Silvano was certain, he held the advantage and waited for the Iceman to obediently walk into his trap like an animal. Ensnared by concern for a hostage, Augustin didn't act blindly as Silvano expected, because beneath the surface of his initial panic, the cold and razor-sharp mind that had carried him to the top of Baltimore was still working at a terrifying speed. And while Wendell and his most trusted men quietly followed every clue, from the escaping vehicle to careless members of Silvano's crew, they quickly narrowed the search to the abandoned warehouse at the harbor that Silvano was using as his stronghold. Augustin decided he would personally go to the meeting place named in Silvano's threat. But he wouldn't arrive as a solitary victim. He came with an entire operation carefully arranged in secret, his men silently closing in on the warehouse from every direction beneath the cover of darkness, ready for his signal, while Augustine himself entered the enemy's lair with a composure so complete it was frightening, the calm of a man who had wagered everything and had nothing left to fear. When he stepped into the dark warehouse and saw Della bound in the corner, her face pale but her eyes still shining with unbroken courage, something inside his chest tightened with anguish, even as it burst into a flame of determination, and he turned to face Silvano, who sat comfortably in a chair at the center of the room, wearing the triumphant smile of a man who believed victory was already his. The two crime lords confronted one another in an atmosphere thick with tension, and Silvano spoke first in a mocking voice, gloating that the untouchable Iceman had finally lived to see the day when he would be forced to bow, that one small woman was enough to bring an entire empire to its knees. But Augustin didn't flinch beneath the provocation. He merely looked at Silvano with green eyes as cold as ice, and answered in his low, quiet, even voice, a voice more terrifying than any shouted threat, that Silvano had made a fatal mistake in believing he could use her to control him, because any man who dared touch her had already signed his own death sentence. Silvano laughed loudly and signaled for his men to attack, and in that instant Augustin gave the command. The entire warehouse exploded into chaos as his men surged from the darkness on every side, and a brutal hand-to-hand fight erupted between the two forces. The pounding of running feet, the crash of overturned furniture, and shouted commands colliding inside the confined space. In the middle of the struggle, Augustin drove straight toward Della, throwing aside anyone who blocked his path with the strength and ferocity of a man fighting for the most precious thing in his life. When Silvano saw the battle turn against him and realized his hideout was surrounded and his men were being overwhelmed, he tried to seize Della and use her as a shield to escape in the confusion. But Augustin reached him in time and stopped him. The two men collided in a savage struggle, yet the fierce determination of a man protecting the woman he loved gave Augustin a strength Silvano couldn't match, and in the end, Augustin brought him down and pinned him to the floor just as Wendell and the others rushed in, restraining the rival crime lord and every remaining member of his crew. The moment it was over, Augustin returned to Della, and the hands accustomed to giving orders and delivering punishment now trembled strangely as he untied her. The instant she was free, he could no longer restrain himself and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly against his chest that it seemed he feared he would lose her forever if he let go. In that embrace, the cold Iceman of Baltimore finally allowed every emotion he had suppressed for years to break free. He whispered beside her ear how terrified he had been at the thought of losing her, that he would rather sacrifice his entire empire and the safety of the heart he had kept closed for so long than allow any harm to come to her. Della, still trembling after the horror she had endured, rested her head against his chest and felt the frantic heartbeat of the man she had once believed was made of ice, understanding that in the moment he chose to charge into the fire for her, instead of turning away to protect himself, he had shattered forever the wall that had separated his heart from the world. Silvano's capture, along with every member of his crew, set off consequences Coralie had never anticipated, because when the rival crime lord was restrained, and Augustine questioned him about the source of the information that had led him to Della, the trail was quickly followed back to the corrupt attorney, and from the attorney directly to Coralie herself. When Wendell presented those findings, Augustine understood that the time had come to bring this entire tragedy to an end once and for all, drag into the light the crime that had festered in darkness for 5 long years. Yet the final and most devastating blow against Coralie came from a place she never could have expected, from the very daughter she had spoiled and trusted above all others, because after watching the entire scheme collapse and realizing that her mother's ship was sinking beyond all hope of rescue, Priscilla coldly began calculating a path to save herself. She understood that once Cory crimes were exposed, she too, as an accomplice in more than one of her mother's schemes, would share the same fate. And within the selfish mind that had inherited every measure of her mother's cruelty, she quickly reached a treacherous decision that the only way to protect herself was to turn against the woman who had given birth to her. Priscilla secretly approached Augustin, and in exchange for leniency and a promise that she would be spared, she surrendered every piece of evidence Coralie had long kept hidden as protection for herself. Documents recording suspicious transactions, letters exchanged between her mother and the attorney, and most importantly, records directly proving their involvement in the arranged death of Mr. Marsh years earlier, the final and most powerful pieces that even when the painstaking investigation hadn't been able to reach. Once that evidence was placed on the table, Coralie's entire crime stood fully exposed and impossible to deny. The scheme to seize Della's trust, the way she conspired with the attorney to drain the fortune, and most cruelly of all, her complicity in silencing her husband when he discovered the truth and threatened to reveal everything. It all lay bare beneath the cold light of justice. Coralie was brought in to face the accusations, and for the first time in her life, the woman who had always been arrogant and certain of herself collapsed completely. Because when she saw the stack of evidence before her, and realized that her own daughter was the one who had betrayed her, who had handed her over in exchange for personal safety, a terrible bitterness closed around her throat. the bitterness of someone who had spent a lifetime sowing cruelty and lies, only to have that same cruelty return and devour her through the hands of the child she herself had raised. She tried to deny everything, struggled desperately, and threw out every kind of argument, threatening one moment and begging the next. But before evidence that couldn't be refuted and the cold, commanding presence of Augustin, every effort was useless, and she understood that this time there was no door left through which she could slip away as she had so many times before. Della was brought in to witness the final truth being revealed, and when she heard every detail of how the father she loved had been driven to his death by this very woman simply because he had tried to protect her, she stood in stunned silence as tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. But they were no longer the tears of a helpless victim. They were the tears of a daughter, who after so many long years had finally obtained justice for her father. She looked directly into Coralie's eyes, not with hatred, but with a calm dignity that wounded the older woman more deeply than 1,000 curses ever could, because in that gaze Coralie understood that the stepdaughter she had once believed she had crushed beyond repair now stood above her in every way, while she herself had lost everything, her wealth, her reputation, her freedom, and even her only daughter. Coralie's downfall came swiftly and beyond all hope of reversal, like a castle built upon sand finally collapsing when the tide of truth swept in, because once the evidence of her crimes was brought into the light, the entire hollow empire she had so carefully built, with stolen money and false relationships, disintegrated in the blink of an eye. The fortune she had taken from Della was frozen and returned to its rightful owner, the old Marsh family home, and everything Coralie had once arrogantly claimed as her own slipped from her grasp one piece at a time, and the identity of a high society lady she had worn with such pride now became a stained garment that the entire city regarded with disgust. The society she had longed so desperately to belong to, the crowd that had once surrounded her at afternoon tea and showered her with flattering praise, now turned its back on her with the same cold cruelty it had shown when its members stood watching Della being struck without a single person intervening, because that had always been the nature of their world, a place where people gathered around someone while power remained in their hands and walked away without mercy the moment they fell. Now it was Coralie's turn to taste the bitter rejection she had once inflicted upon others. Not a single door in the city would open to receive her, no invitation ever arrived, and no familiar face would look at her without contempt. In the end, surrounded by the rejection of everyone she had known, and by the dark shadow of the legal consequences awaiting her, the woman who had once arrogantly believed she could trample others without ever paying a price was forced to leave Baltimore quietly in disgrace, carrying with her a ruined body and a bleak future, with no one to see her off and no one to mourn her departure. Even the daughter, in whom she had once placed all her trust, had turned away to seek a path of survival for herself. As for Augustin, the strange thing was that as he witnessed the complete destruction of the woman who had caused Della so much suffering and had indirectly bound him to the tragedy of years before, he realized that the fear and anger that had once burned inside him had quietly disappeared. It wasn't because he had forgiven her, but because he understood still that someone like Coralie wasn't worth the burden of his hatred any longer. What remained within him was only a distant contempt, the cold indifference reserved for something both despicable and pitiful, because he understood that she had woven the net of her own destruction with her own hands, that her downfall had been created by her greed and cruelty, and that all he had truly done was refuse to turn away from evil, as he had once done years before, finally choosing to stand beside justice instead of hiding within cowardly peace, amid all the ruin and consequences. What mattered most to Della wasn't the punishment given to the woman who had tormented her, but the fact that her father's name had finally been cleared, that his death was no longer buried beneath lies about a man destroyed by debt or illness, but were restored to its rightful truth, that he had been an honorable and courageous father who had dared to sacrifice his own life to protect his daughter's future. One windless afternoon, Della went to her father's grave, placed a bouquet of flowers upon it, and knelt beside the headstone to whisper that the truth had finally been revealed, that he could rest in peace because justice had been done, and because the little daughter he had once called the light of his life had grown strong enough to stand upon her own feet. In that moment, for the first time in 5 long years, She felt genuine peace fill her heart, as though an invisible burden that had followed her for so long had finally been lifted away. That winter gradually surrendered to the warm first days of spring. And one afternoon, as golden sunlight stretched across the glittering surface of the bay, Augustin led Della onto the wide, open rooftop of the Vale estate, a place that now overlooked an immense expanse of water reflecting the colors of sunset, quiet and completely deserted, so different from the crowded and merciless room where they had first met. Perhaps he had deliberately chosen such a place, somewhere with only the two of them and the sound of the sea wind, to tell her what he had carried in his heart for so many days. They stood beside each other at the stone railing, quietly watching the boats in the sky turning shades of orange and red, and after a long silence, Augustin faintly spoke, his voice deep and warm, filled with a gentleness that no one years ago could ever have imagined in the Iceman of Baltimore. He said he could still remember with perfect clarity the first moment he saw her in that crowded room, the moment he crossed the entire hall to reach her, before he had even understood why he was doing it. He told her that throughout his life he had built walls, so he wouldn't have to care about anyone, convincing himself that coldness would keep him safe. Yet in the single moment when he saw her raise her head and refuse to be broken, every one of those walls had begun to tremble. He turned toward her and took her hands in his, the hands that had once been hardened by 5 years of relentless labor and had now slowly begun to heal. And he told her that he wasn't skilled at speaking in beautiful phrases, that he could only offer her the truest thing in his heart. He had crossed a room for her on that first day, and he had come to understand that he wanted to cross every room, every distance, and every hardship to reach her for the rest of his life. She had warmed a heart that even he had believed was frozen forever, and she had shown him what it meant to dare to love and to live fully once again. Then he asked her to remain beside him forever, not as someone he had rescued, but as the woman he loved and cherished with all his heart. Della listened to every word he spoke, and her ash-gray eyes filled with tears, but these were tears of happiness rather than sorrow. He smiled softly, a radiant smile she had lost during all those years of being crushed, and told him that she remembered that moment even more clearly than he did, because in a sea of cold faces that had stood watching her humiliation, without a trace of compassion, he had been the only person who stepped forward. What she had carried deepest in her heart wasn't merely that he had crossed the room, but that afterward he had bent toward her, asked her name, and spoken it with respect. She asked whether he knew how long it had been since anyone had to say her name, as though she were a person worth remembering, how throughout those dark years she had only been the girl, that one, or the servant, never Della, and that the moment he spoke her name had rekindled within her a small light she had believed had been extinguished forever. She tightened her hands around his and told him that her answer was yes, that she wished to remain beside him not out of gratitude, but because she had fallen in love with him, but without even realizing when it happened. She loved the man who lived behind that frozen exterior, a man who carried wounds like her own, and who had joined her in helping them both heal. Beneath the brilliant sunset on the rooftop overlooking the bay, those two people who had once been lonely and wounded held each other tightly, an embrace that needed no elaborate promises, because everything they required was already contained within each other's arms. And so people would later say that the man once known as the coldest crime lord in Baltimore had ultimately revealed himself to be the warmest and most devoted of men, spending the rest of his life loving and cherishing the woman who taught him that even a heart once shattered could learn to love again. And Della, the young woman from whom the entire world had once turned away, finally found not only justice and freedom, but a true home, an enduring love, and a life filled with light, a life her father would surely have watched from that distant place with a peaceful and satisfied smile. Dear friends and listeners, our story has now come to an end, and if Della and Augustin's journey from darkness into light has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that together we can enjoy many more compelling and moving stories each day. How did this story make you feel? And which moment moved you most deeply? Please leave a few words in the comments so we can hear the feelings that come from the depths of your heart, because every thought you share is a source of warm encouragement that helps us continue telling beautiful stories. We wish every one of you listening abundant health, a joyful life, and peace throughout each passing day. Goodbye for now, and we look forward to seeing you again in our next videos.